Hi, everybody. My name is Samantha. Thank you for that warm welcome. So, as Patty said, my specialty and the lectures that I've done for Chicagoans in the past, thank you. So my area of interest is usually maritime history, and I've done spooky Lake Michigan. We've talked about Michigan waterways and tunnels before. I recently did a spooky Lakeview lecture. That was the last lecture I did for Chicagoans. So talking about a FBI sting operation is definitely outside of my usual wheelhouse. But I did find a way into this topic when I heard that the theme was scandals, because so as Patty said, I have an art education. I'm a tattoo artist. I do art history tours, but right after graduating art school, I kind of took a weird little 180 in my career path and accidentally became a paralegal. So the way that ended up coming to be is that I had just graduated from the Art Institute. I wasn't really sure which direction I wanted to go in. When I was doing my degree, I actually was focusing on film work, and then I did some film work and was like, that's not for me. So I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, so I was just looking for a job. And as it usually goes, a friend offered me a job at a family business, and I became a legal secretary for her aunt's law firm. This was I'm not going to say names tonight, but this was a very established family law firm here in Chicago, and I came in completely green, as some of the people we're going to talk about tonight, and then committed a lot of fraud on accident. The straight up, the lawyers that I was working for were pretty crooked. We were representing a pretty major local union, and I got to kind of see the inside about how some of these very old law firms functioned. And in our case, the technology had not been updated since maybe 1995. So most of my job was just cleaning out their outdated email system so that there was room to receive new documents. So I worked at this law firm for about 4 years until I turned 26 and I didn't have health insurance anymore. And then they sent me to drop off some billing at Fulton Market to an office that was down there before it got built up, and I got bit by a bat. And they were like, oh no, oh no, we're labor lawyers and we don't offer benefits. So that was the end of my career there, and since then, the lawyers I was working for have actually passed away. So now they can't subpoena me. And I'm safe, apparently. There were some lawsuits that came out after the fact that I was trying to run away from, because I was like, oh, absolutely not, you're not ruining my life again. But I am an artist who kind of dipped her feet in the weird, corrupt world of local legal politics. So I think, have a kind of unique way of going into this topic. So without further ado, the topic tonight is Operation Greylord, which, when Patty said scandal, this is one of the biggest scandals in Chicago history, but if you're a generation removed, it might not be something that you are familiar with right now. Now, before I start, is anyone in this room connected to Operation Greylord? No? A lot of those guys are still alive, so, don't come at me if I say something a little bit wrong. I tried to get my dates straight. So Operation Greylord was the largest FBI sting in American history up until this point. There was a very corrupt legal system here in Cook County. Chicago was infamous across the country for being incredibly corrupt in its court system. And finally, the FBI decided to launch a federal investigation, plant some undercover agents here in Chicago to try to disrupt this crime that was going on. In the end, they actually indicted 103 different individuals. There were hundreds of more people involved that were subpoenaed to testify, but the 103 people that were indicted, there were 11 judges that eventually went to trial, a lot of county clerks, sheriff deputies, a lot of attorneys, and a lot of policemen that were kind of not only working amongst themselves, but in the organized crime that was in Chicago, and then also on the other side of the organized crime that was happening in the legal buildings in Chicago. So this was a really huge operation. It took a lot of people out, and the thank you. The angle that I kind of decided to focus on in telling the story, because it's a very multifaceted story, there were a lot of moving parts, a lot of different players, was focusing on one particular undercover agent, and that was Terrence Hake. So I'm gonna open my notes here to get into my narrative. Before I go into the story of Terry Hake becoming involved in the FBI, I want to go through a little bit of vocab with you. So some terms that I'm going to use to refer to some of the different levels of corruption that were going on. There were hallway hustlers. So hallway hustlers were the lawyers that were usually in petty crimes court, and the way it worked is that if you were arrested and you were going to go to a judge, you had to pay about 10% of your bond, and the hallway hustlers would kind of target people and convince them to give them that fee in order to represent them. Now, what they didn't know was that after the trial, they would have been refunded that fee if the charges were dismissed. So the hallway hustlers would literally hustle these people, take that money, and then the cases would be dismissed and they would pocket it. Usually there were some kickbacks, meaning that they would then give a little bit to the judge, give a little bit to the arresting officers, and that meant there was an impetus to keep those jail cells full. Then there were the bagmen. Bagmen were the people that were responsible for actually handling the bribe money. So the judges wouldn't take the bribes directly themselves, and the lawyers wouldn't take the bribes directly themselves. There was usually somebody involved that was responsible for moving the money between clients and then the people higher up. Sometimes they would do this in the courtrooms, in the judges' chambers or in offices. Oftentimes they would meet at a secondary location. So it was kind of an open secret, but there were some people that were a little stealthier than others who would actually only do business outside of the courtrooms. And then there are the fixers. So the fixers were the lawyers and judges that were willing to take bribes to fix cases, meaning not just were they going to take a bribe to sort of try to direct things a certain way, but they would actually take the bribe and dismiss evidence, dismiss testimony to make a ruling in whoever was paying in their favor. At the time, it was thought that about 50% of the Cook County judges were corrupt. So that is about 300 So there were about 350 Cook County judges employed at that time, and it was thought that at least half of them were corrupt, willing to take bribes. Paints a little picture of how the court system was working at this time. We'll start with the story of this is in the 70s up to the 80s. So Operation Greylord, the sting operation, started in 1980. The trials would happen after 1984 when the charges started coming out, but the corruption that was leading up to this was very prevalent in the 60s and 70s. I was going to highlight. Questions at the end, please. Yeah, no, you're good. So this is Harry Alleman. And the Alleman case was a really big case that brought to light on a national stage just how corrupt Cook County legal system was. Alleman was a hitman for the mob. He was sort of a known criminal figure. He was a Chicago boy. He was employed by a couple different outfits. And there was a pretty infamous murder charge that he went to trial for. So he had been called on a hit for someone named William Logan, a truck dispatcher. So one night around 11 p.m., he sees William Logan getting off his shift, climbing out of his truck, and he says, "Hey, Billy," turns around, and he shot him 3 times in the chest. Now, there were multiple witnesses on the street who actually saw this murder take place. There was a neighbor who was walking his dog. There was a woman who was on the phone staring out her window and recognized him from the neighborhood. There was a few other people on the street that eventually did give testimony. So when they brought him in for this murder, the prosecutors were really excited about it because it was so hard to nail down these mob guys. And finally they thought, oh my goodness, we have witness testimony. We have him confirmed. This is an airtight case. He's going to go away for this. We're going to actually get one over on the mob. And this will start, hopefully, a new era of having some legal wins against the crime syndicate here. Now, what happened instead, everyone thought that this was an airtight case, that he was going to be charged and go to prison. Instead, the judge, Frank Wilson, dismissed the testimony of the witnesses, and he was acquitted. And all the charges were dismissed and dropped, and he walked away. And this had the opposite kind of chilling effect of really emboldening the mob. So Alleman thought he was untouchable. He could literally get away with murder. And the mob felt really emboldened because now they could kind of disregard a lot of these federal laws. They knew that they had guys high up that were even willing to take bribes for murder charges. So this was a pretty big case. As Patty said, I come from an old Italian Chicago family. I'm 4th generation. And when I asked my family members about this case, they were like, oh, we weren't in that one. But they did remember the Alleman story. That was a really big case that made national news. Everyone thought that he was going to go away for murder, and he didn't. So back to painting a picture of what a normal day in court might have looked like in 1979. There was a judge, Ray Sedini, who worked in petty crimes, what we would call the drunk tank. So he was a big drinker. He would often be too hungover to make his first court appearance at 9 a.m. So what he would do is he would call in and he would ask the cop that worked in his courtroom, hey, Cy, can you put on the robe and just deal with the first round? So the police officer would put on the robe, go up to the gavel, and then have the entire jail cell full of drunks that had been taken in overnight come through, dismiss, dismiss, dismiss. So that when Ray Sedini actually, came in at around 10:11, if he decided to come in, it would be cleared out and it would only be the drug possession cases instead of the drunks. So this was pretty common. They did not take it seriously. Now remember, if there's half of the guys are corrupt and taking bribes and not taking the legal system seriously, there's the other half of honest guys who, for the most part, know that this is happening. And largely, if you were honest, you weren't going to go up in your career because the guys way high up would test you and see if you were, cool. And if you weren't willing to accept money on the side, you were kind of delegated to lesser courts and you didn't get a lot of cases, and that's kind of the way it went. So even the people that were honest sort of had to keep this open secret. I got Alleman up there. So starting with Terry Hake. Terry Hake was a recent Loyola graduate. He was 28 years old. He had passed the bar examination 3 years previously. He was as pretty idealistic as they come. He really believed in the legal system. He was very green. He was excited about the work that he was going to do as a lawyer. He was a good boy from the suburbs who still lived with his parents. And I don't think ever really saw himself as an undercover operative, but he entered the court system and very quickly realized the extent of the corruption. And the thing that actually radicalized him was a case where he was representing the defendant in a rape case. There was a teenage girl who had been pretty violently assaulted by her employer at the grocery store where she worked, and they had evidence, they had medical reports, they go into trial that day, judge takes a recess, talks to the prosecutor, or the other side, and when they come back, charges are dismissed. So he had to then explain to this girl's family what had happened, that there was, something in the legal system that he couldn't explain, that for whatever reason, their child was not going to see justice. And he really took this to heart, and it affected him, and he, wasn't able to look away from how corrupt the system was. So this eventually led him, knowing that it could put a dent in his early career, to making a formal complaint with the state's attorney. I'm still on Alleman. So he makes a complaint with the state's attorney. He had a mentor at the state's attorney's office, Mike Ficcaro. And Ficcaro was also honest, actually, and he passes the complaint along to the state's attorney judicial unit, and they passed it along to the FBI. Because starting all the way back in 1972, when the Alleman case took place, the FBI had started trying to investigate ways into the corruption in Chicago. There had been some false starts. It was very difficult to investigate the court system because of the separation of the branches. So they were really trying to find legal loopholes to actually investigate judges and get into these private chambers where this business was being done. So Terry Hake's name gets passed along to the FBI, and they pick him up one day, and they say, hey, how do you feel about being an undercover FBI agent? And my view of this, the angle that I've decided to take, is that the lesson I've taken from this is that you can be a completely green, idealistic, naive, head in the clouds, moral little good boy from the suburbs, and with that naivety, actually be able to get through and bring down huge rings of corruption. So the people that have become cynical, the people who don't believe there's a way in, are very rarely the ones that are actually going to get that work done. So young Terry Hake says, yeah, I'll do it. And he sort of gets they try to describe the kind of danger that he's going to be in, that he is going to be undercover with some dangerous people, that he can't tell anyone about the work that he's going to be doing, that he is going to have to be okay with his reputation being lost, because what he'll have to do is place himself amongst these corrupt lawyers and kind of go up their ranks and position himself as someone who is also corrupt. So he goes home, he really sits with this. He immediately tells his girlfriend of 2 months. So he had recently met a other young attorney named Kathy, and he was like, I'm in love with this girl. I'm sure I'm going to marry her. I can't go forward with this unless I tell her, because I don't want her to think that I'm corrupt. So he told Kathy, and she was kind of like, okay. And then he goes home, and he thought about telling both his parents, but he decided that his dad would tell the neighbors immediately. So he told his mommy that he was going to be an undercover FBI agent and asked her not to tell anybody, and his mom said, who's going to believe me? So he goes back in, says, yes, I'll do it. And what they kind of talk him through is they have a target at certain law offices. They're going to place him in a new department, new position, and he's going to have to find ways in to these corrupt circles and infiltrate them and eventually be able to gather evidence for them. So they place him at the criminal court building at 26th in California. This is where a lot of petty crime cases were dealt with. We're talking drug possession, prostitution, gambling, stuff that could kind of be dealt with in a few days. It wasn't really the big arbitration cases, but there was a lot of predation that happened in this building. So there was a quota that had to be reached by the corrupt police officers to deliver a certain number of bodies every day, so that the hustlers had a certain number of payouts, so then the lawyers had a certain number of kickbacks, so then the judges had a certain number of bribes. So there was, I'd say, a lot of predation on the poorer, more marginalized communities in Chicago, mostly black and brown people, who would be rounded up for small crimes and then kind of move through this system being taken advantage of. So when I do maritime history, I have done a lot of research in pirate history and a lot of these sort of underdogs and people who committed crimes against the establishment. So I kept trying to find an angle where I was like, do I like these guys? Did they do anything good? And the answer is no. They were absolutely just predatory white-collar criminals that were feeding on people less fortunate than themselves, fixing cases, hurting victims, and pocketing a lot of money on the side. So before I get into how Terry Hake starts going up the ranks, I also want to say that when I was doing a lot of this research, they kept throwing out amounts of money. And in my head, I was like, that's not that much. Would I go to prison over $20? And so I realized that, there was some inflation, some removal of the amounts for me. So I actually put a lot of these standard amounts into an inflation calculator. And I want to let you know that in 1980, $20 was about $75 today. $100 was about $270, or actually, no, $100 was like $340. Okay, so if someone passes you 100, that's like passing you $350, right? And some of these judges were pocketing $50,000 a year, which today would be almost $300,000. So these were small amounts of money from case to case, but as they accumulated, they were getting a lot of illegal income, untaxed income through these bribes that they were collecting. So they placed Terry in the criminal court building, and he is now a prosecutor, mostly in narcotics, in petty drug possession. So he starts kind of looking around. He needs to really learn the lay of the land. He's eyeing different people. He knows who the targets are. There's some judges at the top, some lawyers that he knows are connected to bigger things that the FBI have fed him, but he needs a way into this world. Eventually, they were going to target judges at the very top, and they told Terry this. They were like, here's your first targets. And then he's like, okay, how far is this thing going? And they're like, we're going all the way to the Loop. We're going to the Daily Center. We're going to state's attorney. And the guy that they were after in the end was a Judge Lefevre, who was in charge of the traffic court, but was actually one of the most powerful judges in the city because he placed a lot of the other judges in important positions, and he was a really close friend of the Daley family. So they were like, that's how high up we're going. We're going all the way to the top. And he had also asked them, okay, how many other people are in on this? How many other agents? And they're like, just you. He was like, who was I selected from? And they said that he was selected from a list of one. So, just to say, he was the only person who had filed a complaint and tried to see it go all the way up. A lot of other people just saw this going on and, kind of were resigned to it. So he is placed in the criminal court building, getting going now, and he's kind of eyeing who's my way in, who can I talk to? Their first high target in narcotics court was a Judge Olson. Olson had previously gotten away with manslaughter. He had manslaughter charges dismissed. He was known for having a bad temper, and he had been kind of relegated down to narcotics court because of this temper. But he was very greedy. He was known to take bribes from anybody. He dismissed a lot of cases, and he was actually known for collecting over $50,000 in a single year in bribes. So their first target was, we need to get incriminating evidence on this Judge Olson. And so the guy that he decided to go through was this fellow attorney, Jim Costello. And Costello was an interesting choice. He was a former police officer. He had been a cop for about 12 years before deciding to try to be an attorney. And Costello was not a very well-liked person in the criminal court building. He was very tall and gangly and loudmouthed. He had big, thick, fluffy hair, so he had earned the nickname Big Bird. So Jim Big Bird Costello was a known hallway hustler. He was known to be corrupt. He was known to be a drunk. He would drink during his lunch breaks and then come back to session. And he was such a loudmouth that people kind of gave him a wide berth. And so Terry saw an opportunity to befriend him because he said, I feel like this guy needs a buddy. I feel like he's someone that might be easy to get close to. And even though he's not well liked, he has a connection to a lot of these higher up guys. I know that he's taking bribes. And even if you didn't like each other, the judges and the attorneys needed each other to collect these kickbacks. So they had that working relationship. So he decides to kind of cozy up to Costello. This works out well for him. It started with him asking Costello to lunch a few times. There was a restaurant around the corner from the criminal court building called Jean's Restaurant, Italian restaurant, and this was where most of the people who worked in the building went and had their lunch and also dinner. It was such a known meetup for the lawyers that had actually closed to the public at 2 p.m. and became a private restaurant for just the lawyers. So you can imagine a lot of illegal activity took place at this restaurant that wasn't taking place at the actual courthouse. So they would finish up their cases for the day, grab their briefcase, and then go to Jean's for a few rounds and to actually pass the money around. So he also realized very quickly that Jean's was a kind of center of activity. So Terry and Costello start getting lunch quite often, and almost immediately Costello is just talking at him. He's saying, "Oh, Terry, I'm going to take you under my wing. I'm going to show you how things work. I'm going to, get you in with these guys." And he's encouraging him to take money, to take tips from people, to give money to people, to offer favors. And that was the way that you built trust and kind of found your way through the system. And I do think that Costello was pretty eager to be a mentor, to have someone that respected him and looked up to him, because he wasn't a very well-respected person in the building. And Terry was very fond of Costello, even eventually when he, has to deal with all these people eventually being indicted. I want to say he's fond of him, but he's also so rude about it. He describes him as a pet dog. He said that Costello had, habits that he could depend on, that he was a very charming drunk, and that he really believed that Costello had deeply cared about him as a mentee. And that made it difficult for him later on to indict him. So we'll get to that. There was sort of a moral crisis there, but in the beginning, Costello is his way in. Finally, this is Terry. Terry said that he knew that he had this very innocent look, that he kind of looked like a Boy Scout. He was just a Joe Schmo, and he had a very kind of quiet demeanor, so people didn't think much of him, and that really worked to his advantage. He wasn't a big character. He wasn't a mousy guy either. He was just kind of a cut and dry lawyer. He kind of disappeared, so it took him a while to be noticed by some of these big timers that he was targeting. So Costello takes a liking to Terry, and he starts slipping him money here and there. And this was to kind of bring him in. This was a test to see, if I slip you a 20, if I slip you a 50 and say, hey, take your girlfriend out to dinner, are you going to take it? And eventually, taking money from someone brings you in enough that if they are offering you a bribe or asking for a favor, you're expected to feel some sort of obligation. And after Costello starts offering him money, now they have enough evidence to justify Terry wearing a wire. So he, at this time, is still going back and reporting to the FBI. He's telling them what he's finding out every day. He's learning a lot from Costello. And they decide to outfit him with a wire. And he was really nervous about this, but he's like, okay, I'll do it. And again, they give this kid no training. They do not give him any FBI training, no undercover training. He actually says that he started buying spy novels and taking tips from them. And that some of the things that he learned in his undercover work, he learned from reading spy novels. Such as one of the better pieces of advice that I've ever been given is that only lies have detail. The more detail you give, the more obvious it is that you are lying about something. So he has an early incident. He is given the wire. He's not trained on how to put it on or what to do with it, really. And he's panicking and thinking, okay, what's the best way to wear this under my suit every day? So he puts the recording device, which had a little tape, about 2 hours of tape. He tapes it under his armpit, and then he has the mic fed through, and the mic bulge was under his tie. And he's like, okay, this is the best I can do. Now, I can say this because I'm Italian, but Italian guys are very affectionate. They touch each other a lot. He has a lot of close calls with guys touching him on the small of his back, rubbing shoulders with him, bringing him in for hugs. And he kind of realizes, okay, if I'm going to get close to these guys, especially when they've had a few rounds at Jean's, I can't have it somewhere where they're going to try to grab me. So after some, there was one particular incident where somebody actually felt the recorder, and they were kind of like, what is that? And he panicked and said that he had been camping and that after sleeping on the ground, he needed a back brace. And he starts telling them all about the camping trip, and he's telling them about having to go see the doctor and being outfitted for the back brace. And the guy's kind of like, okay, you know. So he thought it was all over, that he had already been, given up, that they were going to have these suspicions. And the guy's like, okay. He just assumed he was embarrassed about having a back brace, and it gets dropped. And he kind of panics, though, and goes, okay, it can't be in my armpit. So he moves it to his groin, the only place that is kind of safe from somebody randomly touching him, right? So he's wearing this almost all the time. And whenever anyone around him starts talking about taking bribes, or even talking about other people that are known to take bribes, he's recording. So now he's actually starting to collect evidence. Now, the way that the racketeering charges worked at the time is that he needed to get on tape evidence of people taking bribes at least twice in order to be charged with racketeering. So this is really complicated because it's on tape. There's no visual evidence. He can't name exactly who people are. So what he does when he starts taking bribes in these, small cases from people is that, maybe somebody will use a bagman. Costello was a bagman for a lot of people, meaning he was the one actually dispersing the money, right? And Terry would then go up to that person in the hall, or if they were smoking outside, and kind of settle up to them and say, hey, thank you. And if the guy was like, you're welcome, that was enough evidence. So he did try as often as he could to get more incriminating evidence than that. He had a habit of dealing out bribes in smaller bills than most people used. A lot of people use C notes, hundreds. In my family, they say Cecil. I've never heard anyone else say that. So if you're Italian and in Chicago and you call a C note a Cecil, let me know about it. I'm like, that's not normal. Anyway, but a $100 bill was pretty normal. They'd deal things out in hundreds. So a lot of the corrupt people were known to have a couple hundreds in their, pockets, but Terry would try to use smaller bills because if it was a smaller bill, he had the excuse of counting it out and making the bills rustle, and that would be picked up on the recording. So he would count out the money, offer it up, and say, is that good? And if the guy was like, yeah, that was enough. Because nobody was actually saying like, yes, give me the bribe money. It was an open secret, but there was still a lot of code. There was still a lot of code involved in even being brought into this, position. And now that he's recording these conversations and starting to figure out all these different lawyers and police officers that are involved, he's having more frequent meetings with the FBI agents. And like every 80s spy movie that I've ever seen, these meetings would actually take place at the racquetball court. So he describes meeting up with a handler of his, agent Lamar Jordan, and they would meet at racquetball courts in the suburbs, and Terry would hand over the tapes and also hand over all of the bribe money that he had collected. And this was all FBI evidence. And he was such a goody little two-shoes, he never kept $1 of it. He always gave over all of the bribe money that he had received, all of the tips, all of the gifts from Costello. This had kind of a funny effect where most of the guys that were fixers or hustlers, they were flashy about it. They had nice designer tailored suits. They drove nicer cars than their typical salary grade. And they kind of were pressuring Terry after a few months, like, hey kid, don't we, take care of you? Why don't you get yourself a nicer car? Why don't you wear nicer clothes? And he wasn't getting any of that extra money. He was giving it all to the FBI. So eventually, down the road, a year into the investigation, the FBI was going to have to catch up and also buy him a nice car and a nice condo to kind of keep up the appearance. But at this time, everyone's making fun of him for this 10-year-old kind of whatever car that he's driving. And they're like, what's up with you? So he's meeting up at the racquetball court. He's handing off these tapes. And around this time, Greylord is growing. So now it's not just Terry anymore. They have now brought in a couple other undercover agents, another lawyer. They even had a judge involved. There was a judge, I'll get to him when his picture comes up in a minute, actually. But it's expanding. It's a bigger operation. They're starting to get more federal funding. And what they're leading up to is they really need Hake to get enough criminating evidence to justify, to get federal permission to plant a bug in Olson's office. because this was completely unprecedented. It was illegal because it was a breach of the judicial branch, the privacy of the judge. So they really needed enough evidence to get that okay from the top down to bug his chambers. But they knew that if they got that it would open up a lot of evidence for them, because a lot of the discussions that were taking place and a lot of mention of other incriminating people involved was happening in Olson's chambers, because he was kind of one of these main judges in the circle of fixers at the criminal court building. And people would deliver bribes to him directly in his office. So that's what Terry's kind of working towards at this time. He's kind of starting to build relationships with all these other lawyers, but Olson is still his main target, and he's not really getting anywhere with him yet. He's still working his way up. This is like 6-7 months in. He's got these working relationships, but he's still pretty green. And some of the more, some of the more discerning fixers don't immediately trust him. They're waiting for more evidence that he can be trusted so that they can bring him into the work that they're doing. And one of those people was a defense attorney named Cy Yonan. So Cy Yonan was another lawyer that Terry worked with every day, and he knew that Cy was involved and was passing bribes off to Olson, and he saw Cy as kind of a way of getting to Olson, but he hadn't managed to crack him yet. And part of that was that because Cy Yonan and Jim Costello didn't get along very well. And then a kind of opportune case comes up. So this is how it would go. There's so much to this, and I really kind of tried to focus on like what I thought of as the human interest, more anecdotal stories about how incompetent the FBI was. But I should also talk about it. I think I just skipped over the part where I had it outlined, but the cases that Terry Hake is doing, all of the people that he's prosecuting are undercover FBI agents. So when they got more funding and this outfit kind of, expanded, the crimes that he's persecuting, that he's trying to take bribe money for, he couldn't take bribes on real cases. He had to be taking bribes on these fake cases with the undercover FBI agents. So they also couldn't have FBI agents that were based in Chicago because they might be recognized. So they have this process of bringing in people from all over the country. So they had multiple apartments that they were renting out so that there could be a legal address for these people. They had fake IDs for all of them. And they're like, okay, go get a DUI. So then these cases would be given to Terry Hake, and he would pass the bribes from them along to these higher ups and then get the evidence of them accepting the bribes. But the people that were, supposedly having their cases dismissed were undercover FBI agents. So that's another just fascinating part of this to me. Not always, though. Sometimes he was brought into other people's cases. So the instance of getting Cy Yonan and getting in with Cy and then getting into Olson, this really opportune case presented itself. There was a drug possession charge. Some people had been brought in. And Cy Yonan went to the arresting officers and offered them money to drop the charge, to not give their testimony, to not, fill out the report the way that they were going to. And the officers happened to be honest officers. So they were like, absolutely not. And they go over to the prosecutor, Terry Hake, and say, hey, that guy tried to offer us money. And Terry has to pretend to be like, oh my God, that's awful. So Olson's the judge presiding over this case, and Olson tries to dismiss these charges. Hake has to, call and appeal because the officers are watching him. They're going, you can't let him dismiss this. We have the evidence. So to keep up appearance with the police officers, he appeals it, and then Olson invites him into his chambers for the very first time. So he's like, yes, I got it. And he goes and talks to Olson, and Olson's kind of like, what the hell? Like, my game. Why'd you do that? And he's like, I'm feeling, and the cops are pressuring me. They're watching me. So Olson, for the first time, offers Terry a bribe to rescind his appeal and, let him dismiss this case. And they come back out and they, go through their sort of legal jargon, go through the motions. Case gets dismissed. The cops go, and then Terry goes, I don't know. And this is the first time he is able to incriminate Olson directly and get him on tape offering to bribe him. He also gets paid out from Olson through Costello and then meets up with Olson later on and goes, hey, thank you, for this amount of money. And Olson says on tape, you're welcome. And that's kind of the beginning. So now they have enough to at least begin sending up the motion to try to get Olson's office bugged. This is Olson. So I need to tell you all that this man is 49 years old. 49 in this photo. So this is the guy that got away with manslaughter, that was known to be a corrupt judge, that is the first target for Hake's investigation. So now they finally have some incriminating evidence, and even though they haven't gotten the actual permission from, down up to bug the chambers, they start kind of casing the joint to prepare for it. There was even an instance where they asked Terry to somehow get a key to the chambers. So he does his little spy movie thing where he asked a sheriff with the ring of keys. He goes, I left something in Olson's office. Can I have your key? And the guy's like, yeah, sure. Gives him the key ring. He goes in the office. He presses it into a bar of soap. And then the guy's like, hey, I need my keys, because he's, like, what's taking so long? So he runs out and he's like, oh, here. And he's all nervous about it. Passes that off to the FBI. And apparently nothing ever really came of that. I think he was very impressed with himself for doing his little bit of, spy work. But they find other ways of kind of like getting into the office. Another time that they tried to case the joint, to actually spend some time in the office to see how they could possibly bug it. This story really makes me laugh, because even these people that are kind of naive and outside of this circle are forgetting the people that are also in, looking at all this stuff happening, the kind of upstairs, downstairs of it all. So they decide that a good time to case the joint is around 10 p.m. because all the lawyers will be home, but it's not so late that it would be incredibly suspicious to be found there in case you left a document or had to go get your briefcase or something like that. They get into the building, Terry Hake and another agent, and they walk into the chambers, and every janitor in the building, all the janitorial staff, is in the chambers having a party. So they're like, why are you guys here? And they're like, oh, we're leaving. And then the next day, Terry Hake comes into work and he hears that there's a rumor that the janitor saw somebody in suits coming and kind of moseying around last night. So he has one of his other panic moments of, oh my God, I'm found out. But thankfully nobody really knew who he was. Remember, he kind of blends in. So that nothing comes of that. But I just find that story really funny that they were like, never expected, to walk into a literal party when they were trying to case the joint. So there's also some heat on them to get this going because Olson is trying to get moved from narcotics to divorce court. Divorce court is downtown in the Loop. He says about it that there's just small change in narcotics. He wants to go to divorce court because the sky's the limit for bribes. Yeah. So he's actively trying to get moved to divorce court, and they realize that if he moves from the building, then all this investigation that they've done is really only getting them small-time lawyers and not their main target. So there's some more impetus to get the approval. He doesn't end up getting transferred for quite a while, so that ends up just kind of being some motivation for them. But there was some fear about that. The other thing that was putting it on hold was that they were doing this through the state's attorney's office, and very recently, the Republican state's attorney had stepped down, and the new Illinois state's attorney was the second mayor, Richard Daley. So this was him beginning his career, and they weren't sure if Daley was going to be trustworthy to bring in on Operation Greylord because he had connections to a lot of these judges, family connections. He frequently attended baseball games with some of them, attended their family parties. So they were kind of sussing out how trustworthy Daley was, and eventually they had to inform him of what was going on in his position as the Illinois State's Attorney, and he goes, oh, hell yeah. He was 100% behind them, and he even offered to keep up appearances to not arouse suspicion with some of these higher targets. So Daley was also in on it, and that helped them move along with getting approval for the bugging. Okay, so an opportunity presents itself, and they finally get approval. Olson was going on vacation. He was leaving for Miami for a month. And there was a substitute judge acting in his place. So they were like, okay, this is a great time to try to get in and bug his switchboard so that we can listen in on what's happening in his chambers. And instead of trying to do it under cover of night or any of these other stupid ways, they have this very clever idea to go in as repairmen fixing his switchboard. So there was some agents that were assigned to follow the substitute judge home and make sure that he was actually gone for the day and wasn't on his way back. And then meanwhile, a truck pulls up and some other undercover agents go in and say, hey, we're the electrical repairmen. They get led into the chamber. Nobody's there watching them. They open the switchboard and they planted a transmitter radio. So not something that was recording tape, but something that could transmit the conversations to a secondary FBI location downtown where they were recording the transmissions that were coming through. So that goes off without a hitch. Now, for the very first time, completely unprecedented, they have bugged a judge's chambers. And this leads to so much evidence. So Hake's priority now becomes kind of watching who's going into the chambers. They couldn't record every conversation all the time. There was also some liability there, and it was just a lot of tape to go through. So what Hake would do is he would watch very carefully when certain targeted people went into Olson's chambers, and he had a pager on him with certain different signals. So there was a code red, a code black, and different things meant, this person's talking to him right now. So he would press the button, the guys at the FBI office would immediately get the signal, start recording, and then receive that signal of whatever was going on in the office. So Terry also had no way of knowing what they were picking up or what evidence they were receiving. He was just, continuing to do his job. Around this time as well, there was another sort of moral crisis for Terry that came up much later. His best friend comes to him one night and offers him a bribe for a case that he's involved in. This was incredibly upsetting for him because he still was, in his heart, an idealist, and this was his best friend who he had graduated from Loyola with, and it really, really upset him that this guy had been corrupted and that he had this crisis of, oh my God, do I incriminate my friend? Do I gather evidence on this person that was my best friend, even though he's, become a criminal? And ultimately, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna do it. Just even the FBI agents were like, you don't have to. Like, if you can leave that one if you want. He's small time, like literally. And he was like, nope, scorched earth. So he also sees it as an opportunity to get another one of their big lawyer targets, Silvery Bob Silverman, because it's Silverman's case. And if he takes the bribe, he not only is going to end up incriminating his friend, but it'll give him the in with this other big lawyer. So that was something that he was kind of personally dealing with at the time as well. Silverman was a big target as an attorney because he had a lot of mob connections. He had let a lot of big drug kingpins off the line. He had connections to the Italian mafia and the Japanese mafia. And so he was prime target, and he was also one of these guys that was a little bit more slippery. He didn't talk about things in public. He didn't receive bribes directly. He never talked about things, but using his friend as the bagman, he was able to get the incriminating recording, the evidence that Silverman had accepted this bribe. So that's how they brought that guy in. This is Brockton Lockwood. Every time I say that, I think I'm getting it wrong. this was another judge that ended up working undercover. So now we're getting into Greylord as a much bigger operation. They've got a lot of civilian moles. They have a judge involved. They have a lawyer placed in traffic court. It's not just Terry anymore. They're getting a lot of government money to fund this operation. In the end, Greylord cost American taxpayers over $100 million. And that's, I mean, they're paying each of these agents that's committing these fake crimes. They've got a lot of people on their payroll. There's the agents that are recording stuff. There's all the equipment. There's all the leases that they have to maintain. That's where this money is kind of going. But Brockton Lockwood is a judge that comes in. He's placed very strategically in the downtown courts. And he was from Southern Illinois and kind of had a reputation for being a hick because he had a little bit of an accent. So people don't take him seriously. And they don't, really care that he's listening in on this stuff. But he also ended up gathering a lot of incriminating evidence on his fellow judges. He retired and lived on a farm after he retired from the bar. So kind of an interesting guy. He wrote his own tell-all that I didn't get to, but maybe someday. I don't know. I read about 300 pages of Terry Hake's memoir. So I really, it was interesting to kind of try to take the timeline of the operation in between the way that he was personally dealing with the pressure of this. He was incredibly mentally ill, and he didn't know it because it's the 80s. He's dealing with so much stress. He's turning on his friends. He was losing friends because he started gaining a reputation for being corrupt. People were like, I never thought Terry would go dirty. And he had to deal with this. So he, in hindsight, as an older person, kind of recognizes that he was really struggling, but, he had to kind of keep going with it then. There wasn't any outlet. So they also have attorney David Rees, who's working with the Loop lawyers. That guy also was wired and collecting a lot of evidence. He provided enough evidence to justify doing a wiretap with the phone line in the traffic court office in the Loop. So that's another way they're collecting a lot of evidence. They really wanted a cop, and they could not get a cop to work with them. So there was a lot of corrupt police officers, a lot of police who were acting as bagmen for the lawyers and the judges. And every time they, saw an in and they tried to approach somebody, even the honest cops would not betray a fellow officer. So they could not get a cop to work with them. That would have been ideal, because now that there's so many of these fake, bogus crimes that their agents are committing, it would be nice if there was a police officer that they could count on to make the arrests. The people don't have to be actually committing the crimes if there's an officer that's willing to just do the arrest report, right? But they kind of fail at that. They can't get someone. So I read this really funny story that they kept trying to get FBI agents to come in and get arrested for DUI so they could go into the traffic court. And the officers were like, well, we don't want to hurt people. So even if we're doing reckless driving, they're trying to do it in places where they're the least likely to, have other people on the road, but the most likely to get arrested. So they thought it would be ideal to drive a little recklessly on Lakeshore Drive in the early morning. And they would get pulled over, but it was the end of a shift. So the police were like, Because if they arrested somebody at the end of their beat, they would have to go into the station and do all the paperwork. I have heard personal anecdotes in my family, not condoning drunk driving, but where people have been like, oh yeah, I remember getting pulled over, at 4 or 5 in the morning, and the officer would be like, I got 10 minutes left, kid. I'm not doing the paperwork. You better not do that again. So they were actually having trouble getting arrested for crimes. So that's just another kind of funny human interest part of it to me personally. So now getting into this other court system, though, because Terry's still at the criminal courts. He's going to get moved soon. This is about halfway into the investigation. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm going to hurry it up because I know I'm going slower than I thought. There's a lot of info here. But the next stage of this, I previously mentioned this judge, Lefevre. Lefevre was the big guy in charge of traffic court. He was the most powerful judge in Cook County, and he placed a lot of the other judges. So he had this system. He was very corrupt. He was taking a lot of money on the side, and he would test new judges. He would have his bagman, his cousin, dog breath Lefevre. Yes. So I think this guy's name was James, but everyone in the whole operation, everyone that testified later on, everyone referred to this guy as dog breath. So he was a cop. He was the cousin of Lefevre. Their fathers were brothers. So his bagman, his cousin, dog breath, would test new judges by offering them a C note. And if they were like, oh, absolutely not, am I touching that? Then they didn't get a lot of cases. Their careers would kind of stagnate. They weren't invited in. They would be relegated off to lower courts. And if they did take it, they could go up the ranks and eventually be brought into the Fixers Club. And that's what Lefevre called his inner circle. Again, everything's in code. They're saying particular keywords in order to exchange this money. Money is usually being exchanged in privacy. They would sometimes meet at restaurants. Sometimes a lawyer would hand a judge a newspaper, and in that newspaper would be a bunch of cash. Now we're talking the much higher courts. We're even talking assault and murder charges. A lot of this was vehicle theft for some of the people on the side, but we're going all the way up to murder charges. And if a DUI cost $100 to get off, a murder case might be $10,000. And they would pay that fee to the judge to dismiss the charges. So any crime that was happening had a price tag. And some of these higher-ups in the mob and the organized crime syndicate, especially the drug lords, they had the means to pay this off, and they were expected to. So now we're talking big money to get off on crimes. So Lefevre was in charge of this inner circle. He was pretty smart about it. He wasn't really concerned with these rumors that were starting to come up about investigations. And he was their next big target. So Terry eventually was pulled out of criminal court, and they decided instead to create a cover story that he had gone into a private practice so that he could be a defense attorney and they could use him more strategically. So now he's not making his prosecutor's salary. He's actually on the federal payroll and having to keep up appearances. So this is when they buy him that Pontiac. There was another story I wanted to highlight. So something I haven't really talked about and won't talk about much, but some of the slimier people that were involved in this were committing sexual crimes. There was an entire court that they called women's court that was usually prostitution. And even in the lesser courts, if you were pulled in for a DUI or for minor marijuana possession, if you were very pretty, then there were certain favors you could pay with instead. So that was actually a pretty common practice with these guys as well, that they were exploiting women for sexual favors to get off on these charges as well. This is Judge Frank Salerno. Frank Salerno was targeted and actually had a civilian undercover agent placed. He had taken a liking to a 16-year-old cocktail waitress that worked at a strip club in the suburbs, because you could work at a strip club in the suburbs at 16. That was fine. But he took a liking to this girl, and he paid to get her a fake ID and then get her a job at his favorite restaurant in the Loop, where he did a lot of his dealings. And he actually then used her as his personal bagman. So she was a waitress at this restaurant. Clients would come, pass her the money, supposedly as tips, and then he would come and visit her, and she would hand off the money to him. So the FBI picks up on this, and they're like, hey, 16-year-old girl, do you want to come and work undercover for the FBI? And again, I imagine she really didn't know the danger she was in. And they bring her in a very opportune way, no training. They make her wear a wire under her dress, and she starts collecting incriminating evidence to target Salerno in particular, but also some of these guys that are passing her bribes. Supposedly, she never actually was romantically involved with him. he just really, really wanted her. And she would kind of leave him hanging, and he kept giving her gifts. And part of the way I actually believe this and maintain it is that she would be like, no, I can't possibly, even though he was giving her fur coats and lavish jewelry and all these gifts. She couldn't even, be somewhat intimate with him because she was wearing a wire at all times. So, there was the actual danger as well of giving up the case if anything was allowable. So that's just another little side story, part of this larger operation, the civilian moles that they're using now. Moving on to another judge. I know every one of these guys is like a cartoon character, right? So this is another of the judges that they're targeting. This is John Dollars Devine. So in my family, there's Joe Soda Pop. I have Uncle Boxhead. This Banana Nose. Dollars and dog breath don't really faze me the way that I imagine other people do. For some reason, my nickname is Tomato Can. All my uncles call me that. But anyway, John Dollars Devine is another target for Greylord. He dealt in auto theft court. And was kind of infamous for his willingness to take bribes. That's how he got the name Dollars. He was very, very stealthy about it. It was really hard to get him to admit to anything on tape, to talk to anyone but his personal bagman. So it was, a whole kind of play to try to incriminate him. I really love this story too. So finally, Terry Hake is still doing these cases. He's trying to get in, collect. He's still recording these conversations. At this point, he has infiltrated the Fixers Club. He's kind of known for being a dirty lawyer, but he's still not, making connects with everybody personally, especially the ones that are very, very reserved about it. And Devine was one of those people. So again, they also need to get him on tape at least twice in order to indict him later on. So there is a fake case that comes in. There's an FBI agent that gets arrested, and Hake is representing them, and Devine is the judge. So Hake goes through the motions of passing a bribe up high to the judge, and he accepts it ostensibly, but he still needs the evidence. So he looks for Devine after the recess. It gets postponed or continued. And he walks up to him and asks him if he had received it. The judge goes, yeah, and then walked away. That was enough. That was enough for one. So unfortunately, Terry wouldn't get the second incriminating evidence for another 17 months in the same case. So 17 months later, this case finally gets pulled back to trial, because that's how these things go. And the really funny thing is that the undercover FBI agent that was the defendant, 17 months had gone by. This guy was on another case in LA. He couldn't be called back in for this, so they had to get a different guy to play the same guy and just hope that nobody involved noticed. And it worked. Terry had also made sure, they tried to pass it off to different judges. The reason it took so long is because Terry kept insisting that it had to be Devine, that there were special circumstances that demanded Devine preside over this case. So finally they get the second agent to come in. Devine doesn't notice, and he sends him up a bribe. And then he cornered him at lunch and says, I can be fair with you, Judge. And Devine goes, whatever you want. And Hake asks, hey, is this much okay? And he is rustling the bills for the tape recorder. And Devine would take it and said, sure. And then walked away. Count number 2. That was enough for putting Devine away later on. So this is about when they tap the wires in traffic court. So many police officers use this phone line that when they start handing out indictments for the judges, they also ended up subpoenaing over 100 corrupt police officers that they collected evidence on while they were doing the phone tapping. The IRS is also involved at this point. They are, looking into these targets, looking at their spending, looking at their tax reporting, and trying to find the evidence of this outside untaxed income. How are they buying that yacht? How did they get that car? And some of these people were really good at hiding the money as well. Some of them thought that they were untouchable, that they'd never been caught. They could just buy another house with their dirty money and it was fine because, they're judges. Nobody's going to come after them, and they're being very careful about it. So it's really starting to close in, and it's become a very big operation at this point. There was a known fixer, a Judge P.J. McCormick, who was particularly hard to pin down where this money was going. So they had evidence that he was fixing, but they didn't know where the money was going. They couldn't find the money. And it turns out that every time he accepted a bribe, so if the bribe was $100, he would walk outside, and I was a paralegal in the loop. I know, how this goes. He would go to all the different banks and buy very small money orders with different tellers at different banks, and then use that as the cash. So there was no other record of where this money was going. He would take the cash, buy the money order, and it was in such a small amount that it there was never any suspicion on it. So eventually, when they find out that that's how he's doing that, McCormick was also indicted. This is Lefevre. This is Lefevre, the big guy. This is the kingpin of the judges, guys. This is the one whose cousin is Dog Breath, who he's paying off. So there is starting to mount some tension amongst the fixer circle. Somebody had alerted a officer, Ira Blackwood. He had a guy at the phone company, and the guy calls him up and says, "Hey, your building's getting tapped." So they knew that there was some sort of federal investigation going on at this point. But they still thought that they were untouchable. And they knew that, they can investigate, but what are they going to get on us? They didn't think that there were moles. They didn't think that anyone was, listening in outside of their offices. So they implement some new rules. They say, don't talk about anything on the phone. And they're like, I think we're fine, guys. Then a journalist starts kind of poking their head in. And they don't know who he's talking to, who's willing to talk to him. But there's this guy that's trying to find a story about the corruption at Cook County. And so Lefevre calls a meeting with some of the big fixers and a lot of his sheriff's deputies and people that are close to him. He calls this meeting and says, we're going to flatten the building. We're putting everything on lockdown. We're not taking any bribes. We're not doing anything for 60 days. So that there is no evidence that this reporter could possibly, catch us in the act of. And this actually kind of works. There's not really much going on. People are refusing to take bribes. It's kind of a low, calm period. But the one thing that happened that eventually, also adds to the tension that breaks the case is that there is a woman who ends up talking to this journalist. There was a lady who had a ton of parking tickets, and in order to avoid the warrant for the parking tickets to come in and pay off these 15 parking tickets that she had, there was a police officer who tried to bribe her, and he was basically like, okay, if you give me $200 right now, then the rest of the tickets will disappear. She thought that this was legal. She thought that she was paying a fee up front that was like half of what she owed in order to avoid going to trial. So she wrote him a check. And he should have been smart enough to say, I can't take that. But instead he takes the check and then he cashes it in his own name. So he was going to keep it all for himself. He was supposed to send the kickbacks up to the judges. He selfishly keeps it to himself. And then he left on vacation and forgot to dismiss the tickets. So she gets the warrant, and then she goes and says, I paid this off. What's going on? So she knows the officer she spoke to. She has the evidence of writing the check. The check was cashed in his name. So this is kind of one of those first breaks, just somebody being kind of stupid. And the FBI approaches this officer and says, we will prevent you from losing your pension on criminal charges if you flip and work with us. And he goes, yeah, sure. So this officer, McCausland, is the first police officer that they get to flip. And they make him wear a wire, and he, goes undercover. He's not good at it. He's obviously not a very smart guy. And pretty much immediately, there's a lot of suspicion that he's wearing a wire. And people are like refusing to talk to him. So Dog Breath goes to Lefevre and says, hey, we think McCausland's wearing a wire. And Lefevre says, kill him. Yes. So Dog Breath's not really an enforcer. He's kind of like, that's not my deal. Like, he kind of talks him down and is like, let's not take out a hit. Like, that would just call even more attention to it. Let's just pretend nothing happened and make it go away, and nobody's going to talk to this guy. So that's kind of what ends up happening with that. Can I move on? No, that's at the end. So this is the beginning of the end. This rising tension, suspicions everywhere. At this point, a lot of people are suspicious of Terry Hake because it came out that when he was in law school at Loyola, he applied to work for the FBI. So somebody starts spreading this rumor that he's one of the moles, that he's working for the FBI, and he has to very loudly be like, not me, guys. I would never do that. And he does this by actually, he calls these guys up and is like, mad about it. He's like, how dare you accuse me of that? You think I'm, not loyal? He has to make a whole show of trying to allay suspicion. But it's kind of closing in at this point. In August of 1983, there's one more really funny story. So, before the case breaks, because the case is just about to break, and once it is broken to the newspapers, there's no going back. The investigation has to end. The indictments are going to start rolling out. They can't collect any more evidence. But the thing that actually breaks it is so funny to me. It's the FBI just kind of fucking up again. So there's all these fake cases going on all the time. They've got FBI agents posing as criminals, getting arrested so that they can infiltrate the court system. And there were some agents that came in, and they were tasked with getting into a brawl at the water tower place. So they start fighting each other. Somebody, throws the other guy to the ground. They get arrested for making a scene. But when they take the guys in, when they book them, they both have the fake IDs that they were given from the FBI, but the one guy has his FBI badge in his coat pocket. So it comes out that they're both FBI agents, that they were clearly faking this scene so that they could be arrested. And this is what breaks to all the fixers that, yes, there is an active federal investigation. There are FBI agents posing as criminals. This is like a much bigger thing. Nobody can be trusted. And Terry Hake's also panicking about this because every single sequential thing that's happened is making him more and more nervous because he's not an actual FBI agent. He's still just an informant. He doesn't have federal protection. He's still in a lot of danger doing this work. So he's calling them. He's like, guys, how the hell did that happen? And his one of his handlers, Reedy, says the weather. And he's like, what do you mean? And he's like, the guy was, leaving to go do the play. And at the last minute, he was like, oh, it's a little colder than I thought it was going to be. So he grabbed a different jacket. And that jacket happened to have his ID in it. So that's what busted Operation Greylord, is it being a little bit cold outside. So after that incident, it gets broken. There suddenly is headlines across the paper. This makes national news. Somehow all of the investigation comes out that there has been an undercover investigation in the court system, and that charges are going to start rolling out, that pretty soon these people are going to be called to trial. So a lot of people panic. A lot of people suffered from health and stress consequences. One guy just flat out had a heart attack and died. Because these are not street criminals. These are white-collar criminals that thought that they were going to get away with it forever. So very few of them were prepared for the consequences. And now I get to talk about all the consequences. So immediately people start coming forward and saying, like, I want to make a deal. I will testify against my colleagues if I can, make a deal with you. They get a lot more police officers that way. They approach some of the people that they really wanted to testify. They approach Ira Blackwood, who was the bagman for some of those judges, and he refuses to betray his fellow officers. So he ends up losing his pension and going to prison. But they managed to get a few people to flip on them. And the first person that Terry Hake wants to try to flip is his good friend, Jim Costello. He's like, I really genuinely care about Jim. I feel warmth towards him. He was a good friend to me, even though he's a criminal drunkard. And I would like to try to save him if I can. So he sets up a dinner where he personally will try to bring Costello in and make a deal with him. They meet at a public bar. Everyone else in the bar is an FBI agent because Costello carried a gun with him. So he sits down with Costello and basically goes, hey, all those times I said it wasn't me working for the FBI? It's totally me. And I would like to offer you a deal as, a gesture of good faith, essentially. And Costello was very, very upset and refused. And he was warned against hurting Terry, which I think also was a kind of personal insult for him. He really saw Terry as a brother. He had invited him into his family. He, knew Terry's family, knew his girlfriend. Like, they had actually created this bond that was very real for Costello. So he was really affected by this. He didn't take the deal, and he did end up serving time, and then coming out, and I think he relocated, and I know that he spent the rest of his life after prison with his second wife. So if you cared at all about Jim Costello, that was what eventually happened with Jim Costello. He didn't have quite as hard a time as some of these other guys who faced consequences. But Costello is a bust as far as getting him to testify against his colleagues. So they try a few other people, and finally they get somebody that was kind of a wild card for them. That's how Hake explains it. Somebody that he didn't really notice or think was big time. There was an attorney that had worked with him all the way back in criminal court named Peter Kessler, who was a Polish Holocaust survivor. He had immigrated to the US, become a lawyer, and kind of found a also sideways in way of becoming corrupt, just trying to provide for his family, taking the side money. And he felt really guilty about it. And once things came to light, he said, for the record, whether he meant this or not, that he saw testifying as a way of sort of cleaning his own conscience, that he felt guilty about what he had done. So Kessler becomes really key for them and does a lot of testifying along with Hake against the people that they had formerly worked with. The other key witness that flips is Dog Breath. So there had been some family tension. Dog Breath was real tired of being the second fiddle in the Lefevre Boys, apparently. So he flips and he works with the FBI, and he was the key witness testifying against his cousin when his eventual trial came up. And, they had very evil, talented lawyers representing these judges. And two of them got acquitted, actually. They had their charges dropped because there just wasn't enough evidence. But most of the judges that were indicted served time. And there was just so much evidence against Lefevre that unanimously, with Dog Breath especially on, it's fun to say, giving this testimony, he was found guilty of all 59 counts against him. So the trials are kind of coming and going, this is over the course of years, because they can't do all these trials at once. Most people were not being held. They were, still white-collar criminals, so they're being called to trial and then sent off to prison at sort of staggering degrees. So some of these trials were years after the indictments came out. Over that time, there were 3 suicides. So some of these guys just couldn't handle the pressure. They didn't want to go to trial. They didn't want to go to prison. They couldn't handle it. They knew they weren't cut out for that. There was a couple cases like this. So there was a police officer who was asked to flip. He was asked to make a bargain with the FBI in order to keep his pension and avoid prison time, but he refused to betray his fellow officers. And he ended up the next morning, after talking to his attorney, he had breakfast with his daughter, and she said to him, "Are you scared of going to prison?" And he just answered, "No." And then he said, "I think I need some air." And he walked out of his condo and shot himself in the throat. So, yeah, anyway, this is what I normally talk about, so sorry if I'm a little uncouth about it. There was also a very sad suicide of one of the judges that was meant to go to trial, this guy, Alan Rosen. Alan Rosen had been a crooked judge in divorce court, and there was actually a organization of his victims called Victims of Al, people who accused him of basically selling children to their parents in custody battles. So when the indictments are coming out against him, instead of facing this bravely and going and serving trial and serving a sentence, he took his Purple Heart, because he had been a Marine, and a few photos of his children, and he went to his favorite gym and went into a tanning booth and also shot himself. In the tanning booth. My thing is, like, you could go somewhere where, like, somebody doesn't have to deal with this, So there was, I don't know which paper it is, definitely one that wasn't as respectable, but there was a paper headline the next day, "Final Verdict, Suicide." This is, I have no pictures of dog breath. I really wish I did. But this is a drawing of the case where Dog Breath went on trial to testify against his cousin. So a lot of these cases were very highly publicized. This made national news. A lot of people were following this. And there, again, had never been such a huge criminal investigation into the court system before. In the end of, I think 92 people actually were charged. 11 judges served time. Anywhere from 6 to 18 years. Lefevre went to the same prison in Wisconsin as Devine, and so many of the judges and lawyers were sent to this prison that they actually organized a softball team called the Bagmen. I love that. And then back to Sedini, the judge that I had started talking about, the guy that would be so hungover all the time that he would call in and tell the cop to put his robe on. He had one of the largest indictments. He had 21 co-defendants that he brought down with him. He got 8.5 years. And then one of the biggest cases, and this is kind of leading up to the full circle of the story, there was a judge, Thomas J. Maloney, who became the first judge ever charged with accepting bribes for a murder case. So that was a pretty big one. That was a big deal. Again, unprecedented. And he went to prison. They had at least 3 instances of him accepting bribes to dismiss murder charges. And, this was enough. Even though they didn't get everybody, even though they had wanted to go further, this kind of struck the fear of God into the court system. And this thing was really, really shut down. And in the next few years, as more and more corruption was kind of stalled and brought to light, in 1997, so still a ways away, but this was, again, full circle, Alleman was brought back to trial for murder. So the guy, the mob hitman at the very beginning that kind of set this in motion, he had committed a murder in front of witnesses. He was dismissed. It was obviously fixed. And so it went back to trial because it was the first time they could prove that the murder trial had been fixed. So that precluded him from, getting the jeopardy of having the previous dismissal. So it went back to trial. The same witnesses came and testified. And they were like, "Is this the guy?" They're like, "Yeah." And he was charged with murder and given 3 life sentences. Yeah. So justice was served. That was 25 years after the original murder. Yeah. So with that kind of concludes what I had to talk about in this Operation Greylord, the largest undercover investigation in Cook County history. And obviously nothing in Cook County was ever corrupt ever again. my drink.